Konnichiwa. Today, we're going to talk about questions that aren't questions. They come up all the time in Japanese, so it's important to understand what they are and how they work. So, what we're going to talk about is the particle ka. Now, we probably know the particle ka as a kind of verbal question mark that goes at the end of desumasu sentences to turn them into questions. However, we don't use ka, as we explained last week, at the end of sentences to mark them as questions in regular, non-formal Japanese. Why not? Because putting ka at the end of a non-formal sentence sounds kind of blunt and rough. It's not ungrammatical and is sometimes used by male speakers who want to sound blunt or rough. But generally speaking, we don't use it. We indicate questions by intonation in regular speech. But we do use the ka marker all the time, just not at the end of sentences. What do we use it for? Well, we use it to mark questions, but not quite what we normally think of when we say question. So let's start right off with an example. Suppose we say, Sakura ga kuru ka wakaranai. What we're saying is, I don't know if Sakura will come. And what's literally happening here is that we're turning the logical sentence, the proposition, Sakura ga kuru, which means Sakura will come, into a question. And then we're saying, wakaranai. So we're essentially saying, Sakura come question, not clear. The question of whether Sakura will come is not clear to me. In English, I don't know if Sakura's coming. Now, we can use this as part of an actual question. We might say, Sakura ga kuru ka shitemasu ka? Now, if we ask that in desumasu form as I just did, we use a second ka at the end to mark the actual question. So we're saying the question of whether Sakura will come. Do you know? And we should notice here that what's happening is, first of all, the ka is turning the proposition, the question, into something noun-like, which we can then use as the basis of a new sentence. So that's the first thing we need to notice. And the second thing we need to notice is that ka displaces nautical particles most of the time. So, normally when we say wakaranai, you say nani nani ga wakaranai. If we say shitaru, we say nani nani wo shitaru. But in this case, the ka particle displaces the normal logical particle. So we say Sakura ga kuru ka wakaranai. Not Sakura ga kuru ka ga wakaranai. So Sakura ga kuru ka is a noun-like entity, which, because it ends in ka, doesn't need to take the usual nautical particle. Now, it also gets used in the common expression ka do ka. And although we can learn this as a glued together expression meaning whether or not, so Sakura ga kuru ka do ka wakaranai means I don't know whether Sakura's coming or not. In English, that's how we'd say it, as opposed to Sakura ga kuru ka wakaranai. In English, we'd say I don't know if Sakura's coming. Sakura ga kuru ka do ka wakaranai, we'd say in English, I don't know whether Sakura's coming or not. What we're literally saying here is, Sakura coming question, how question, wakaranai. So what we're saying is something like, I don't know if Sakura's coming or how it will be. Then from this, we can see how we get the use of ka to mean or between nouns. So we can say, Ocha ka koji, dochira ga ii? Tea or coffee? Which would you like? Yeah, how is this working? Well, essentially, this is an abbreviation of Ochaka Kohika Dochiragani. So we're putting two propositions side by side, whether coffee or whether tea, and then asking Dochiraga e. Then once again, although this seems like a different use, ka is doing the same thing. It's bundling something up as a proposition. And remember that when we use or in English, it's always got to be a question. It's never a certainty. If we say A or B, we're saying it might be A and it might be B. If we say A and B, we know what we're talking about. We know that both A and B exist or do whatever it is we're saying. But if we say A or B, we don't know whether it's A or whether it's B. We know it's one of them. So again, this ka, this questioning whether particle, is continuing to use that function of marking a possibility, a question. Something that might happen or might not happen, might be there or might not be there. Now we see this at work, for example, in kamoshirenai. Now this is taught as if it were a word or expression that means maybe. And it is, but teaching it as a lump like that, as I've explained in another video, is misleading. The point of that misleadingness that I would like to talk about here is that it confuses us about what that ka is actually doing. That ta is attached to the proposition that we are talking about. So if we say sakura ga kuru kamoshirenai, perhaps sakura will come, what we're saying is sakura ga kuru ka, that's the question or proposition that we're talking about, and then mo shirenai. The mo is giving us the meaning of even or as much as I've explained that it very often does, and shirenai is shiru, know, shireru, ability to know or be known, and the helper adjective nai. So the whole thing actually means sakura ga kuru ka, the question of whether sakura comes, mo shirenai. I can't go so far as to know. Maybe sakura will come. Maybe she won't. Similarly, with Kana, which is sometimes presented as a particle, meaning I wonder, you see how this actually works. Ka is taking the proposition. So if we say sakura ga kuru kana, we're saying sakura ga kuru ka, the question of whether sakura will come. Na. Now, na, as we've discussed in another video, is a marker that indicates addressing something to yourself. So you're saying, will sakura come? Addressing that to yourself. The way we would say that in English is, I wonder if sakura will come. I am pondering the question of whether sakura will come. And while it's alright to learn things like kana and kamoshirenai as if they were what the textbooks say they were, lumps of grammar that you just have to memorize, it helps not only with those, but with structure as a whole to understand what they're really doing. They're bundling something into a question. A proposition becomes a question, which is a noun-like entity, which we can then add something like, do you know? I don't know. I can't be sure. I wonder. I'm addressing this question to myself. Now, from this proposition-making quality and questioning quality of ka, we get expressions such as one which we discussed in a previous video. Marude yure o mita ka no yo na tao. Now, that means a face as if one had seen a ghost. So what's the ka doing here? It's doing the same thing as before. It's marking yure or mita as a question, a proposition, a thing that's not certain. In fact, in this particular case, a thing that hasn't happened. We're not saying that the person has seen a ghost. We're only saying that she had a face as if she had seen a ghost, or we're marking the proposition that she'd seen a ghost as a question and then continuing to comment on it. And in this case, we actually are attaching a logical particle, the logical particle no, to the ka-marked noun-like entity that we have made of the proposition that she is, say, a ghost. So with the no particle, unlike the ga and wo particles, we can attach this to a ka-marked entity. Now, there is another use of ka, which is a little different, but still closely related to its question-making quality, and that is in certain expressions where it negativizes what we're talking about. An example of this that you probably come across if you've been watching anime or reading manga is Monka, and that's short for mono-ka, and it cannot be used in more formal speech, in which case we say mono desu ka. So, if I want to say, sochira e iku mono desu ka, I'm saying, I won't go there, I'm not doing there. I say, Sakura ga kuru mono desu ka, I'm saying, Sakura's not coming, she won't come. There's no likelihood of her coming. What does mono desu ka mean? It means, literally, is that a thing? So it's a question. But it's the kind of negativizing question that we also get in English when we say things like, do you think I'm going to do that? Or, would I do that? Or like, how likely is that? In all those cases, by turning something into a question, we're denying its likelihood. Now when we say mono ka, it's the same thing, and it often gets reduced right down to monka. So someone might say, sorry o taberu monka, I'm not eating that. And you notice here that we are, in fact, using the ka marker after a regular non-formal sentence. And that's because monka or monoka is in fact rather a rough way of talking. You're denying something very forcefully and often in opposition to somebody. Another place where we often see ka as a negativizing question marker is again dokoro ka. Now, dokoro is a form of tokoro, which we talked about in a recent lesson, didn't we? Tokoro can mean not just place in the literal sense, but a time or a circumstance or condition. When it's said as dokoro, it's usually negative. So when we say dokoro ka, we're negativizing what came before it, and usually putting an even stronger negative after it. So if we say, for example, Kenji ga yomeru dokoro ka, hiragana mo yomenai. Not only can't I read kanji, I can't even read hiragana. What's dokoro ka doing here? Well, of course it's negativizing, just as we've already seen that it can, but it's also using the concept of place, dokoro, that's to say conceptual space rather than literal place. We're saying, not only can't I go as far as reading kanji, I can't even get to the point of reading hiragana. That's the metaphor that's being used here. Not only has the situation not reached this far place, it hasn't even reached a nearer place than that. So we see that while ka has a variety of meanings, all of them are closely connected to its ability to make a question and turn the question into a proposition, but never a proposition that exists in actuality, always a hypothetical condition. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels who make these videos possible, and there's also a list of my red Kokeshi, my assistant producer angels, in the information section below. And I'd like to thank all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere, and I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.